Good morning, everybody. I am Joanne Koontz. I am here today with my partner, Jackie Durham. It is May 4th, and I didn't watch Star Wars or Star Trek or whatever is May the 4th be with you, but I understand that today's a big day if you like such things. So count me out on sci-fi. Count me in on this. So today we wanted to bring to you the topic about franchises. We run into franchise agreements with some frequency. Lots of times we have clients that are interested in leaving a business that they're in and possibly buying into a franchise. So we wanted to kind of just bring to you some of the issues that we see, and not only problems, but just things to be mindful of before you get involved, because there's some great franchises out there and there are some that are not as well organized. And so we wanted to kind of bring you some tips and tricks and things to watch out for. So if you have questions, as always, you feel free to use our Q&A bar at the bottom. These webinars are recorded and distributed all on our YouTube channel, on our Facebook pages for Koontz Associates and Koontz & Parkin, and on our websites, KoontzAssociates.com and KoontzParkin.com. So if this wasn't fun enough to do once, you can do it again, or share with your friends that are thinking about franchises. So without further ado, Jack, what have you got?
So just to kind of build upon what you just said, I think that franchises can be a great opportunity for a lot of business owners, because you basically are stepping into a package system where you have names and branding and marketing and even systems, procedures, and products that are sort of tried and true by the franchisor, and they've kind of worked out all the kinks. So that's essentially what you're investing in. With kind of some of the hefty fees that can come along with investing in a franchise. So to me, for certain buyers who like some structure and who are a little unsure of exactly how they want to operate a business, it can be a really good opportunity for you to get your feet wet and to step into a system that is pretty much already ready to go and worked out, and you do have some support there from the franchisor. So that's really attractive to some folks. However, on the flip side, you have to keep in mind that when you sign that franchise agreement, you are relinquishing some of that autonomy you have as a business owner, because there are systems and procedures and products and guidelines that you have to follow when you sign that novel size franchise agreement. So it's a great opportunity, but there are some pros and cons. So I kind of wanted to go through in our first part of this webinar just some of the provisions that we see with some regularity, and what you and your attorney need to focus on and make sure you're taking a look at and discussing very carefully based on your particular circumstances of your business. So I guess the first and foremost is going to be the term of the franchise agreement and any kind of options for renewal. This is really important because some of the franchise fees that you pay on the front end can be pretty hefty. So it's a substantial investment on your part, and you want to make sure that you are receiving the longest term possible based upon these terms and conditions that you're comfortable with. And this is important to make sure that you're kind of locking in what you're comfortable with for an extended period of time. The shorter the franchise period, the more likely it is that if your term expires, that you'll be required to sign a new franchise agreement that may contain different terms that won't maybe be quite as favorable to you. And also, just if you can, building in options for renewal of those terms based upon the existing franchise terms that you're agreeing upon initially. That can be a really attractive provision to include, just like you would in a commercial lease. So you want to take a look at the term and the options, because those are first and foremost some of the most important parts of your agreement and arrangement with the franchisor. In addition to that, I would say the territory. That is one item that I think is very, very crucial, because again, what you're paying for when you buy into a franchise is typically the exclusive right to operate that franchise location and a particular radius of mileage exclusive to all other franchisees. There are certain franchise agreements that I've come across where you are not receiving an exclusive territory, and you may have to share with other franchisees or with the franchisor themselves. That to me is a lot less attractive, and you need to consider that when you're sort of negotiating the royalties and the initial franchise capital fees, because that's going to eat into your business if you have a competing franchisee a mile away. So that's definitely something that you want to take a look at, and you shouldn't assume that you're going to have an exclusive territory, because that's not always the case. The other item, trademarks. So again, going back to what I said when we opened, when you're buying into a franchise, you're buying the branding, the name, the goodwill associated with that name. But sometimes the franchisor has not necessarily trademarked that name. So what that means is it's a little less secure, meaning that a third party could come in and assert legal rights to the use of that name, in which case you would have to abandon the use of that name. The franchisor would as well. But you're that's part of what you're buying when you're investing into a franchise. So if you crack open your franchise agreement and it disclaims the fact that they don't own any trademarks on that name, that again needs to be something that you're considering when you're investing in a franchise, because that is sort of a wiggly asset that could be pulled out from under you. So again, just something that you want to take a look at and make sure your attorney has a peek at and confirms. Advertising. There are a lot of restrictions typically in these franchise agreements, and it's going to vary franchise by franchise with respect to how you can advertise, where you can advertise, and what other franchisees can advertise in your territory. Not always is it intended to work out this way by the franchisor, but sometimes the way it's crafted in your franchise agreement, you could have other franchisees essentially poaching your customers because they're allowed to advertise in your territory. So you want to make sure that those provisions are nice and tight, so that in addition to having that exclusive territory to operate in, that you also have an exclusive advertising territory as well. One more thing I wanted to mention about the training and staffing. A lot of times with different franchises, you either have to bring in franchisor training employees to your location to train your staff and your managers, or you may have to send them off to training, sometimes even out of state. So whenever you're kind of budgeting for your initial investment in the business, it's important to look at what the training requirements are, because if you have to send your staff out to Arizona or your managers out to Arizona to receive a particular kind of training, that's going to be an investment on your part. And sometimes there's recurring training, annual training or semi-annual training that's required. So all of this adds up to the total investment that you're going to make in the franchise. So you want to make sure you have your arms around what that's going to look like and what the training requirements and staffing requirements look like. Again, that takes away a little bit from your autonomy as a business owner, because you may think you only need 6 employees to operate this particular location, but your franchisor may require 10. So that's going to eat into your bottom line, and that's going to increase your overhead. So just, again, something to make sure you're cognizant of so you don't have any surprises once you actually open your doors. The other item that I think is one of the most problematic for some franchisees is that there's typically provisions that give very broad discretion to the franchisor to require you to invest in new equipment, updated software, new decor, new signage, new branding, new marketing. All of this, again, comes out of your pocket. So if you buy into a franchise and a year later they kind of rebrand and rejuvenate their look, that's great. It's great overall for the franchise itself, but it's going to be an added expense that's going to come out of your pocket, and many times there isn't a great lead time in terms of notice that you'll receive. So it's really important to make sure that you're looking at that requirement, that you're budgeting for it, especially given the kind of equipment and tenant improvements that you're initially putting into your space where you're going to be operating. So that's just a budget item that you need to keep in mind. A way that it can also sometimes get franchise owners is if you go to sell your franchise. Sometimes there are changes that have happened already, and maybe your franchisor hasn't required you to bring yourself up to speed to fit with those new requirements. But if you bring in a buyer, typically the franchisor is going to require that buyer to sign a new franchise agreement, not necessarily assume yours, which means the buyer is going to be required to assume the new updated standards in terms of equipment, furniture, decor, fittings, things like that. And some of the assets on your asset list may have to come off because now they don't comply with the new franchise requirements. So just something to keep in mind that has surprised a few people in business sales, unfortunately. The other thing I would say though is, Joanne, I'm sure you can agree that at the end of the day, the franchisor, when they make these upgrades and modifications to the requirements, it's really for the benefit of the franchise in general, because the franchisor is in the business of selling franchises. You as a franchisee may be in the business of selling sandwiches or whatever the nature of the franchise is. So your interests are a bit different, but I would say that rising tide raises all ships. If you improve your outfittings and your equipment and things like that, and as long as your co-franchisees do as well, it's going to be for the benefit of everyone. It's going to increase the value of your franchise, which is going to increase the resale price ultimately. So it may be a little bit of a hit at the time, but I think ultimately it's for the greater good, especially if you intend to hold on to the franchise for a few years.
Yeah, and the thing is with that too, where we really see people get mad is when they disagree. Like, I don't think this is better. This isn't going to improve, or this is going to make it harder, or whatever. And some people, when we see people getting out, a lot of times it's because, they disagree, and it starts to feel corporate-y, and that you have to be mindful that if you're getting involved, and there's various levels. I've seen franchises that people would come to me and say, oh, well, I want to ask them for this. And I'm like, they're probably not going to agree to that. And then they roll over and they're fine. So not all franchises are McDonald's or Chick-fil-A or huge, huge companies. There's also, small franchises where the person that you're speaking to is not some legal team, but it's the person who created the idea. So keep in mind that when you talk about flexibility and when you talk about changes and the procedures and systems, just because it's a franchise doesn't mean that's foolproof, because there are some that are tried and true, and there are some that are just coming online. And you should see a difference in the franchise fee based on that. It's, you're not going to get, I've seen franchises that were $10,000 to get in. You're not getting into McDonald's front door for 10 grand, let alone.
Right.
Because that's a machine that's been built and torn apart and rebuilt. So that's just something to keep in mind when you're talking about those kind of provisions, is be mindful of the size and scope and nature of the franchise that you're dealing with, because those can't be treated uniformly.
Yeah, exactly. And speaking of asking for permission, you need to be prepared for asking for any kind of permission for the transfer of your franchise rights, or for the early termination of your franchise rights. That's definitely something that if you get into this and you don't like it and you want to sell the business, or you just want to terminate your franchise agreement altogether, that can be extremely difficult and many times unsuccessful. So unfortunately, it kind of reminds me, and when I've been involved in some of those negotiations, it kind of reminds me of back in the short sale days, where the franchisor is not going to give you the time of day or even entertain your request to terminate early until you actually stop paying. Because as long as you're paying them, they have other bigger fish to fry. They're typically more compliant and responsive when it comes to a request for a transfer of the franchise. But just keep in mind that you can't just transfer your franchise rights to someone. You can't pledge them. You can't even actually transfer your business assets typically. Typically, the franchise agreement restricts you from transferring, even if it's not substantially all of your assets, just some of your assets, or even some of your inventory. That you're going to have some constraints there. So again, those are provisions that you really want to take a close look at and make sure before you get married to this franchisor that you are ready to do that, because once you sign, you're stuck.
Well, and that's another thing to your point in the beginning when you said about the term. Like, you want the term to be as long as possible if you're in love. On the flip side, you need to consider maybe you don't want such a long term, because typically in the franchise agreements, you're paying whether you are operating or not. So the shorter term would leave less risk to you financially if the franchise didn't take off. So
exactly,
that knife cuts both ways, and there's no way to know that going in. So if it goes gangbusters, you want a long term so that you can't be shoved out or renegotiated. And if it's not going gangbusters, you want a short term, and we don't know that going in which one it's going to be. So
yeah, which is why, again, if you can negotiate a couple of options for extension of the term, that's beautiful. I mean, that's what I want in a commercial lease. That's what I want in a franchise agreement for my franchisee, because you have that ability to pull out if you decide it's not for you, or you can extend it if you want to. So it really puts you in a better position.
And that's really anything in business. You want that continuity. You want the same location. You want the same people. You want the same everything until it's not working, and you want to be able to dump it. So
right, exactly. So also something that needs to be carefully examined, because I've seen these getting a little more aggressive in the franchise agreements, and that's the restrictive covenants. So you may enter into a franchise agreement where, of course, during the term of the franchise agreement, you can't compete with the franchise. But even after termination of the agreement, you are restricted from competing with the franchise, and even working with some of the same customers that you serviced while you were under the term of the franchise agreement. So that comes as a shock to some buyers and to some sellers who didn't necessarily notice that provision when they were going in. And it can kind of bind and tie your hands. So you definitely want to take a close look at that and negotiate that to something that you're comfortable with on the front end. The other thing I want to mention is the franchisor typically reserves to themselves a lot of levity when it comes to an early termination on their end. You can't terminate, but they can certainly terminate with a certain amount of notice under a lot of very wiggly circumstances. And sometimes it can be as wiggly as in their sole discretion. So that to me gives me a little heartburn for my franchisee clients, because conceivably I could invest all of this money on the front end in terms of the initial franchise fees, and then two years later have the franchise agreement terminated at will by the franchisor. That doesn't happen a lot, but you know, you have to keep in mind that if it's in the agreement, will they exercise and enforce that right? Maybe not, but they could. So you have to kind of weigh that risk and make sure that if there is a termination right that's reserved to the franchisor, that it's something reasonable at least, so that you don't get the rug pulled out from under you.
that always cracks me up when people are like, oh, well, we would never do that. Well, then take it out of the agreement.
Then take it out of the, take it out of the lease. Indemnification, again, another provision that can nail people. And this is one of those
that's a bone you like to chew on.
I freaking hate indemnification. Here's the thing. It's not a problem until it is. Indemnification is a very simplified version of an insurance policy.
Mm-hmm.
If I incur liability, you, party B, agree to pay me, party A, for that liability. So under the indemnification clauses in these franchise agreements, a lot of times what it says is that the franchisee owner is going to indemnify the franchisor, reimburse the franchisor for any liability that the franchisor incurs, unless the liability arises solely from the franchisor. Now, I don't know about you, Joanne, but I rarely see a situation where only one party is at fault. Typically, it's a combination of a couple of parties. So that's a really high threshold to meet. And what that means is you as a franchisee might find yourself in a position where you have to indemnify your franchisor for their own negligence or wrongdoing, which is not fair, but that's, franchise agreements are not where you're going to locate fairness. So, so you want to make sure, what I guide clients to kind of do in this situation is you can obtain from certain insurance companies contractual liability insurance. And so what you would want to do is make sure that you get some contractual liability insurance to cover that risk, and just make sure that there's no exception for negligence or liability that's caused in part by the franchisor, because now you have no coverage. So that's kind of one of the ways that you can mitigate that risk, or you could have your attorney negotiate that particular provision to make it something that's a little more fair, so that you're not indemnifying the franchisor for their own wrongdoing. So just a heads up about that. I've seen that a few times in franchise agreements, and I'm just like, no. Also, the personal guarantee. You can bet that the individual owners of the franchisee are going to have to sign off on a personal guarantee, and sometimes that personal guarantee is required to extend beyond the term of the franchise term if you are going to extend, or if you transfer your rights under the franchise agreement. So you may have to stay on the hook for the performance of your buyer after the fact. So I'm going to get to that in a second. There's certain considerations if you enter into a sale of your franchise business that you need to make sure that you have certain contingencies built in, but I'll get to that in just a second. The other thing I want to mention is the renewal of the agreement. Earlier I mentioned that if you reach the end of the term and you want to renew, and you don't have an option built in, you're typically going to have to renegotiate the franchise agreement and sign the then current agreement that the franchisor is offering its franchisees. Just bear in mind that the terms are probably going to look a little different because these franchise agreements, like most agreements, are going to evolve over time based on the experience of the franchisor with its franchisees. So just be prepared for the fact that what you're signing now may look a little different in 10 years from now if you go to sign a new agreement with your franchisor. Now, if you're buying an existing franchise, what I always recommend is that you make sure that you have a nice, clear contingency that makes your option, or your obligation, I should say, to purchase contingent upon not only the franchisor approval, but also your approval of the assignment terms or of the new franchise agreement that you're going to sign. Oftentimes, when I'm not involved in the negotiation of the purchase agreement, I will get a contract in my lap. It's already signed. We're already cooked here, and the buyer has agreed to purchase subject to the franchisor's approval of the buyer. However, the approval may be contingent upon franchisor terms that you're not comfortable with as a buyer. So you need to make sure that you're crafting that contingency very carefully. On the flip side, if you're selling your franchise business, you want to make sure that you are baking in certain contingencies for the release of the personal guarantee, like we were just discussing before, because many times the franchisor will say, well, I'll let you transfer, I'll let you sell, Bob, but Bob, you're going to stay on the hook as a personal guarantor for the balance of this franchise term.
Yeah.
So that can put you as a seller in a bit of a situation. So you want to bake in that contingency for yourself, and both parties need to make sure that you are contracting for who exactly is going to assume the franchise transfer fee, because those can be pretty hefty, and a lot of times that's not included in the contract. If you aren't using an attorney to prepare the agreement, it kind of gets overlooked and it's an afterthought, and then it kind of becomes an issue at closing when we're trying to figure out which side of the closing statement that transfer fee falls on. So
And everybody goes,
hey, the broker told me that Bob was going to pay this.
Yeah, nah.
But the broker didn't include it in the contract, unfortunately. Also, something that I think is really, really important is the conflict that can arise between commercial lease terms and the franchise agreement terms. And I've actually seen a few clients get burned on this, unfortunately. You need to make sure that when you're negotiating both of these agreements, even if you're not negotiating them concurrently, that you are contemplating the terms that are in each of these agreements. Sometimes in a commercial lease, the commercial landlord, especially if you're leasing from a large commercial landlord, they have the right to kind of move you around the shopping plaza. They can even move you to a sister shopping plaza if they want to. The problem with that is your franchisor also has approval rights of where you operate, because that has their name on the door, and it's their branding. So they want to make sure that they're approving of the space where you're leasing. Well, the problem can arise where a landlord decides to move you to a different complex in a less desirable space, and you don't really have a leg to stand on, because of course that's provided under the commercial lease. It's very difficult to get large commercial landlords to part from that provision. So you need to make sure that at the very least you include some kind of conditional clause in your lease and in your franchise agreement that provides for the approval of the commercial landlord if the franchisor is having you do something that the commercial landlord reserves the right to approve under the lease, and vice versa. So if your franchisor decides that they want you to make certain tenant improvements or renovations or modifications to your space to comply with new franchisor requirements, that's likely going to conflict with your lease, because your landlord is going to have to sign off on that. If they don't agree to that, now you're in breach of your franchise agreement. So you need to make sure that your attorney is taking a close look at this and building in the provisions that are necessary to make sure that you aren't tied and you aren't required to take one action under your franchise agreement or under your commercial lease that's going to trigger a default under the other. That's really, really important. Would you agree, Joanne?
That is probably the most important thing that you couldn't think of on, like, the average Joe stumbling around. You're looking at the four corners of the agreement, and it is completely reasonable to not even be mindful of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, lastly, one of the last items I wanted to cover that I think is also sort of an afterthought, but I think it can really, really help a franchisee and a commercial tenant is having the right insurance in place. So in addition to having the commercial general liability coverage that every business owner should have, I also recommend that contractual liability coverage, which I was mentioning before. And you want to make sure that your attorney is taking a look at what it actually covers and what's accepted from that coverage, to make sure you're crafting that very carefully with your insurance agent. And also business interruption. I think if COVID has taught us anything, it's that is a really crucial policy to have. And again, to make sure that it's not gutted by these overreaching exceptions. So the business interruption coverage should include things like rental and franchise fees and things like that can become interrupted under certain circumstances, because your franchisor is going to expect their monthly royalty fees and other fees that they're entitled to under the franchise agreement, regardless of what the circumstances are. So if there's a pandemic, or if something else happens, if somebody gets sick or is in the hospital, and you know, things happen. And that's why that business interruption coverage can be absolutely crucial to a business owner, unless you're sort of self-insuring and just stashing away a huge amount of savings to the side. So you either pay your insurance broker or pay cash.
So true. It's so true.
So those are my my main thoughts on you know, entering into franchise businesses and these franchise agreements and sort of how they play with other aspects of your business. Again, I think overall it can be a really good opportunity for people, but you just have to go in with your eyes open, and you want to make sure, again, that you're looking at your commercial lease along with that franchise agreement. I can't stress that enough.
That absolutely. And the other thing to be mindful of is not just people, when people look at the money about a franchise, they look at the buy-in, they look at those franchise fees, but you really need to look at, if this doesn't go well, what am I on the hook for marketing and royalties, minimum marketing and royalties, even if the doors are shut, because closing the business doesn't get rid of your problem. So you need to budget that in to say, if this doesn't go well, I need to have $1,000 a month to burn, or whatever the number is, on mandatory marketing dollars or minimum royalty dollars, that even if nothing is happening. And COVID is a great example. Like, there was no provision in there, and if you didn't sell because you couldn't be open, then you still owed that royalty. Like, you've got to have a plan B. Not that anybody can plan for COVID, but now we have to, because you don't know what's going to happen. So
yeah,
you know, it's like I said, when I talk to people, a lot of times when you tell them the quote of how much it's going to be to dive through their franchise agreement, depending on the length, sometimes they're like, oh my gosh, that's crazy. And so they'll say, well, just give me the nuts and bolts. And sometimes by the time I've gotten through what we've gotten through today, they're like, forget it, I'm out. Or, okay, I think I can do that. But, you know, it's funny because I had particularly one good client of ours had switched industries, and they were looking at a franchise, and, you know, we're concerned about the investment to have us chop up the agreement. And I said, well, here, let me tell you off the cuff, without looking at yours, boom, boom, boom. And she was like, oh my gosh, they had already read it, which was nice that people read. I don't expect that always. It's a pleasant surprise when I get it. But she was like, you hit every single one of our concerns. So there is some familiarity or similarity between these agreements, but they are all different, and every franchisor is different. So, and the value that you're getting is different. So you can't just say, oh, it's a franchise, so it's, you know, they'll say there's no guarantee of success. It's true. But some just make more sense than others, and or vis-a-vis the cost. So just something to be mindful of. So I appreciate your dutiful review as always, because you are so thorough with such things. And like you said with the lease, there's a lot of this that is more than meets the eye. And I will say, as with anything when it comes to the law, if you think it's simple, with anything, not even limited to the law, if someone says, oh, that looks simple, that means you don't understand how complex it can be. So from painting a house to re-roofing to legal documents to TurboTax, it's not as easy as it looks.
to my husband planting the bamboo in the backyard. It'll take a weekend. 5 weeks later.
Yeah, that's true. So thank you so much. As always, everyone, as I mentioned, you can replay this broadcast. We will have it posted to our Facebook page, to our YouTube channel, and on our websites, Koontz Associates and koontzparking.com. Next week, watch out, we're bringing real estate back to you, and we're going to be talking about escalation clauses. This market is certainly smoking fire hot, and escalation clauses are now a new thing that a lot of the folks in Florida were not accustomed to. Some of the folks out west, if you've come from out west, might have been. But tune in for that. We'll see you next Tuesday. Thanks, Jackie.
Have a great week.
Bye.